In January 2023, I decided to set off and start walking from Bateman's Bay up the east coast of Australia. And I wound up walking 1,200 kilometres over about 7 weeks. My goal was to get to Brisbane, but I ended up getting to the Gold Coast, which is about 80 kilometres south of Brisbane, and wound up in hospital. But that's a whole different story. There's videos about that. But what I wanted to talk about is what led me to make the decision and finally to execute such a long walk. It was an unofficial walk. It wasn't like the Appalachian Trail or something. It was just walking up the coast. So I'd walk up through national parks, I'd walk along highways, freeways, fire trails, and basically it was a mission to get from one town to another and try and make sure I had enough water and food. So going back, I think I got to start back in 2017, which was when I decided, with my girlfriend and I, we decided to move from Canberra, the capital city of Australia, down to Hobart in Tasmania. Plenty of reasons for that decision. Mostly, like, for my girlfriend, she had friends down there. For me, it was just like an exciting new place. I'm always keen to check out new places. I've got that wanderlust that never really goes away. So I enrolled to do a fine arts degree in Hobart, and we got there, like, we didn't even think so much about finding a place to live or anything first. I spent half of my savings on a car, which we packed with all our stuff, and we drove down to Melbourne and got the ferry across to Devonport in the north of Tasmania. And then we just drove into Hobart. We didn't know where we were going to stay, didn't know anything. Now, back in early 2018 when we did this, there was no such thing really as the current rental crisis. Like, it wasn't in the news. It wasn't a big deal. I'd never heard of it. I'd never really thought about, oh, gee, it's hard to find a place to live. Like, even with my unofficial rental history and my lack of traditional full-time employment, I'd always been able to find at least, share houses or granny flats or whatever, or speaking to landlords, personally, and them getting my trust. And I'd never really had trouble with that. But once we got there, all the locals started talking about how, like, oh, it's really hard to find a place to live all of a sudden. 6 months ago, like, people in share houses in the middle of town were only paying $80 a week. So my girlfriend and I, we ended up applying for houses and apartments, like the cheapest things we could find, basically. And we spent, I think it ended up being 3 months, like, living out of the car. We'd sleep on the beach, we'd sleep up on Mount Wellington, or we'd stay in caravan parks or hostels, or sleep in the car, or we'd meet people at bars and crash on their floor. And eventually, like, I think we applied for about 45 places. There was one night and we were staying in this horrible little, like, dungeon underneath this dude's house. And my girlfriend said, if we don't get a place tomorrow, I'm leaving. I'm going back to Canberra. I'm going to go keep re-enroll in university up there. And I thought, well, what am I going to do? And because I didn't have much money left, and obviously I didn't want to try to study at university while being homeless, I didn't have a community in Tasmania or Hobart. And I basically thought, I'm just going to walk. I didn't know what that meant. I was pretty naive at the time, but I just imagined being like some kind of modern Jesus figure, just walking. No money, whatever, just walk down highways with a blanket. It was kind of this romantic vision I had. And I started looking up people who did that, like a guy called Planet Walker, John Francis, who refused to take motorized transport for like 17 years back in the 1970s. And other people like Peace Pilgrim, who was a lady in the 20th century who walked all around America, maybe all around the world, and literally just had no money, but she was doing it for peace and for anti-nuclear missiles and all that kind of stuff. But the next day, a real estate agent who had seen us as a couple come and apply to so many shitty ass places was like, she put our application on top and called us, said, guys, do you want this place? So we did. We moved into this tiny, cold, black mold infested apartment at the bottom of this building in North Hobart somewhere. And we spent almost a year there. And eventually when we decided to leave, it was like, I guess we decided to go back to the mainland because it was just, I can't remember if we got given notice, but I know that the place was so bad that the black mold, we kept trying to get rid of it. We kept going to the real estate agent. They didn't do anything about it. So we ended up going back to Canberra. And that was the first time my girlfriend went overseas for a while, and I spent the summer living out of my car. And it was the first time I'd really been homeless, and it was a real shock. There was sort of a novelty, like a feeling of adventure about it, but I wasn't very good at it. I found it really uncomfortable sleeping in the car. And basically, the apartment that we'd left in Canberra a year and a half before, our old room was available again because we knew the landlord and knew the house. And I just had to wait until it was available. And so my girlfriend and I moved back in, and it was like a dream come true. I was like, oh, we got this nice place. It was the best place I'd ever lived. Anyway, the year went by. My girlfriend and I broke up. I ended up living in a series of horrible share houses. I just, at this point in my life, I just found it really hard to live with younger people who had their own like partying agendas and all that kind of stuff. I was already trying to quit alcohol the whole time and couldn't do it in those situations. And eventually I got to move into that apartment when my ex-girlfriend called me and was like, I'm moving out of the room. Do you want it? I was like, hell yeah. It was cheap. It was good. I moved in. It was fantastic. I was really happy. The rent was cheap. And I lived with people who I really liked. It was kind of like a dream come true, and I didn't have to make much money. I could go busking and work in a little cafe and not do much at all for money and just focus on music and reading books. And it was a really nice time. But of course I wanted to go new places and see new things. And the rental crisis that was in Tasmania that hit when we moved there, I didn't realize that it was kind of going to spread all over the country and all over the world. And in February 2020, I decided to leave this nice apartment and move to Adelaide, where I could house sit for my uncle, his family was over in Malaysia on holiday. Now, what happened in February 2020? There was this virus going around, and of course I didn't take it very seriously. I thought, it's just going to blow over and life will continue as usual. So I gave notice, packed up, took my meager possessions across to Adelaide and house sat my uncle's place. Then the virus got really bad. We went into lockdown and my uncle had to get on a flight with his family back to Australia ASAP. And because I had to quarantine and because I was terrified of getting COVID as well, I left that place and ended up sleeping in the driveway of a friend of mine in Adelaide, which was like a lifesaver because otherwise, the borders were closed. I had nowhere to go. And so I slept in his van for about a month until I ended up back in Canberra. I hired a car and ended up house sitting for an uncle in Canberra and basically wound up down the coast, the south coast of New South Wales for the pandemic, living with my mother through lockdowns. And I'm really lucky that I had that and that I had somewhere to be and didn't just have to rely on the state. But basically my whole life I still had hope that I could be a successful musician. And with COVID and with lockdowns and the situation, just living in this small town on the south coast, I couldn't predict the future. It felt like it was never going to end. And I'd always been a big drinker, but it became almost fatal. I wound up in hospital a few times. I was just drinking so much, and I started taking all sorts of pills. And it wasn't until, a few more stints trying to live in places in Canberra, trying to go to university, ending up back on the south coast, trying to build a career as a busker again, that it was late 2022 and I decided I just had to get sober. And my sister got sober. She was like 4 months sober and had been going to AA meetings. And she talked to me about it. And I remember November the 26th, 2022. I don't remember what I did that night, but The next day I woke up and I haven't drank since. But I ended up going back to Adelaide and staying with my mate whose driveway I'd stayed in during the pandemic. He doesn't drink, and I really needed that. So for a few weeks I just hung out with him, got sober, and wound up coming back to the South Coast for a bit. I was like, I can't just stay here. If I just stay here, I'll just stay here forever. And by this stage, you know, the rental crisis was everywhere. And basically, it just felt like if you have a roof over your head, it's like finding gold. It's like winning the lottery, and you just can't give that up. And that's not the way we should live as a society. It's not the way the economy should operate. There's no way you can just move around for jobs anymore, and there's a worker shortage everywhere. So if you, for instance, if you're on the dole and receiving unemployment benefits, you have to move somewhere if there's a job available, but there's nowhere to live. So they're basically telling you have to be homeless. And how can you work that job if you're stealth camping, I guess? They don't really provide accommodation. A lot of businesses have started to have to provide accommodation because it's just ludicrous. And the feeling of hopelessness that this engendered in me was really triggering me back to wanting to drink. So I basically decided to take control of the situation, bought a hammock, a backpack, and I got the bus up to Bateman's Bay and just started heading north. And I walked. At first I was running with a really light pack, and I made a whole video series about this. You can watch it. There's a playlist. Well, I'll make a playlist. And yeah, it was incredible. It was terrifying. I was in thunderstorms. I was trying to get through national parks. The whole thing was about trying to find food and water. But all my existential worries, even worries about, like, you know, where I'm going to live, what's my career going to be, they kind of just fade into the background when you're walking all day, every day, and you're thinking about survival. There is nothing better than at the end of the day when you just eat something and drink something and you're in the hammock somewhere and you just feel so good, and you wake up in the morning and you keep going. Unfortunately, I didn't realize I was gluten intolerant, and I made myself increasingly ill and wound up in hospital. But, you know, there's videos about that. So if you're interested in that, check it out. After the walk, I had a period where I was back at Mum's place, just really not sure what to do with myself. But I've kind of got to the point where I'm like, yeah, I'm a musician, I'm a songwriter, but I've got two practices. One is walking, and one is playing music. And they both counterbalance each other. And it's a horrible situation for people who need to rent all around the world. I try to just make the most of it. It means I don't have to spend much money. And when I go busking and stuff, I just save it all up. Means I just see myself as nomadic and travel. It's very hard to think about settling down anywhere and having a career. But I guess in the 1930s you were a wandering hobo, and it's kind of like that now. And it's okay to romanticize this stuff, because without romanticizing it, it's just pure hell. And it shouldn't be pure hell, because life is really, really special. Just to be alive. And, you know, I guess it's that gratitude stuff that you really start to naturally feel that when you're out in nature and walking and pitching your own shelter and all that kind of stuff. Playing that rat race where you have no control of your situation. You're applying for places to live, and your only choice ends up being living with a bunch of anarchist junkies. That's pretty sickening. But what can you do? I mean, this rental crisis isn't going to change anytime soon. It's not treated like an emergency, which it should be. If it was a famine, a food shortage, I think it'd be pretty different. But, you know, shelter is second on the list of Maslow's hierarchy. So it's pretty important. But this is my way of dealing with it, and it's been good. I've got a lot of help from friends and family, and I like walking. And I like playing guitar and writing songs, and I'm going to keep doing that. I'm going to keep making these videos, and they'll be interesting, because it's going to be an interesting life. Already is. Thanks for watching. Peace.